So, Evelyn, did you kill Stephen?
No, he was my perfect husband with me. No.
Dear Evelyn, you were convicted in court for the murder of your husband, Stephen. 32-year-old Englishman Stephen Davis was gunned down in his apartment in the Philippines. It was during a hot night in July 2002 that Stephen Davis was murdered in his apartment. Margaret Davis, Stephen's mother, remembered getting a phone call the following day. She said a voice at the other end of the phone simply said, "Stephen's had an accident. He's dead, Margaret." And then the line was cut off. She said she was numb, and she sat motionless in disbelief for an hour. Before a second call came through, she discovered that Stephen had been murdered, shot dead by 3 gunmen in the middle of the night in his apartment. These calls weren't from the Home Office or the police. They weren't from Stephen's wife, Evelyn, with whom he had a 3-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. These calls had come from her son's best friend, Mike, who had been asleep in the same apartment in the room next door to Stephen. Stephen was born in 1970. When Stephen was only 21, he'd been working at a computer company in Nottingham already for a year, when he was approached by a larger firm in Hong Kong and offered a position there for triple the salary. Dharam Samar is a remote island in the Philippines. You can only reach it by boat, and there's no electricity or running water. Evelyn Bohol, the woman Stephen would eventually fall in love with and marry, grew up here. She was just 13 when she left the island and moved to Angeles City, a grueling 2-day journey by bus and boat. It's where many young girls go to find work, because Angeles is known as the sex capital of the Philippines. It often descends into a spiral where girls become hooked on drugs in order to cope with the lifestyle they're forced to continue doing. The only way out is often the hope that a rich man will come and rescue them. And that's basically what happened to Evelyn. The two met in one of these bars, and Stephen was instantly infatuated with Evelyn. Stephen took Evelyn out on a date, and then went back to her place of work and paid the bar owner a fee of £500 in order to release her from her contract there. It was during a visit to Hong Kong in 1997 that Margaret met Evelyn for the first time. She was just 17 years old, 10 years younger than Stephen. Margaret noticed that Evelyn was quiet, polite, and, in her words, totally acceptable. During the visit, Stephen made a surprise announcement that they were getting married. It was here that Margaret, in particular, noticed some rather worrying behaviour from her new daughter-in-law. She said there were several times that when Stephen went to take Evelyn's hand as they were walking, she'd often push him away. Even so, the two settled in Hong Kong, seeming to adapt to married life very well. They had a daughter, Jessica, in 1999, and then a son, Joshua, 2 years later. Stephen was earning £60,000 a year as a computer technician, and he gave Evelyn a monthly allowance of £1,000. But Stephen wasn't just financing Evelyn's lifestyle. He was regularly sending money back to her parents on the island. They were able to buy a large fishing boat and to construct the only brick house in their village. He often paid their fares to visit them in Angeles City too. During one visit, they noticed that Evelyn was acting strangely. She was texting furtively, and she would go a little bit away from the group to make a phone call, and they would hear her giggling to whoever she was talking to. She'd been seeing a man. He was a local who worked for a security company, and his name was Arnold Adore. Meanwhile, Stephen wasn't stupid. Even he was becoming suspicious of Evelyn. Money had been going missing, and one day he was mortified when he took his daughter, Jessica, to her new nursery school, only to be turned away and told by staff that her name wasn't even on their list. He'd given the substantial sum for the school fees to Evelyn, and it had somehow disappeared. He gave Evelyn an ultimatum, demanding that she paid back the money that had gone missing, and either get a job or go to college. But she refused, and in response he threatened her with divorce, something that would, in all probability, mean that she would lose every privilege she'd become accustomed to, and end up either working back in the seedy bars of Angeles City or returning to her family's rural province, neither of which was an appealing prospect. On the 18th of July 2002, Margaret got the phone call that was to turn their world upside down. Stephen used that apartment during the week while he was working in Manila with his business partner Mike. Mike woke up when 3 men broke in. One held a gun to his head and asked him, in Tagalog, "Is this him?" He was told no, and then they burst into Stephen's room and upon seeing him, fired 4 shots into his body. After they fled, Mike checked Stephen but found no pulse, and then he called the emergency services. Margaret immediately voiced her suspicions. Had this got anything to do with Evelyn? Initially, Alan said he couldn't see it. She was a lot of things, but a cold-blooded murderer. Not to mention the fact there was nothing tying her to the crime scene. At the funeral home, they encountered Evelyn sitting inside on a chair. As they went in, she didn't stand up or acknowledge them at all, and she refused to join them as they viewed Stephen's casket. Alan recalling that she never even shed a tear. Eventually, Margaret coaxed her over, and the first thing she said was, "Have you seen Mike?" Here they were, standing over Stephen's body, and the first thing she said was, "Have you seen Mike?" Margaret said it was at that moment that she decided to note down and record diligently every interaction that she had with Evelyn. She engaged her own private investigator, who conducted round-the-clock surveillance on Evelyn, discovering that 2 men were visiting her home regularly, her boyfriend Arnold, and another man who worked with him. They passed this information on to the police, who brought both men in for questioning. Ultimately, Stephen's business partner, Mike, was able to identify both individuals as 2 of the men who broke into the property that evening and held a gun to his head, and they were subsequently arrested and detained. She had her son's ashes in her suitcase, and they had 2 suspects detained in a jail cell. Her next priority was her grandson Joshua's safety. Margaret discovered that he was staying with Evelyn's parents, and she asked her PI to go over to the island and offer the family £200 to release the boy. Baby Joshua arrived back at London Heathrow and was reunited with her again. It was Evelyn's brother-in-law, Gina's husband, who was to provide the final piece of the puzzle. When the police had tried to question him, he'd gone into hiding. Fortunately for Margaret, Evelyn's auntie had known where he was and tipped the police off when Evelyn had picked him up in her car that evening. The 4 then drove to Manila with Arnold and his friend and parked outside Stephen's apartment. Evelyn handed Arnold the keys, and she waited downstairs in the car while the 3 men carried out the attack. Robin confirmed that it had been Arnold who had fired the 4 shots at Stephen. Arnold Adore and his associate were convicted and are serving life sentences. In February 2004, Evelyn was also arrested and charged with Stephen's murder. In her case, a judge was able to consider all the evidence and decide whether her actions made her responsible for Stephen's death. Evelyn denied everything, but there was convincing evidence against her. The perpetrator had keys, there was Robin's testimony, and the fact that her alibi was shattered when a neighbour reported seeing her returning home in the early hours that evening after she'd already claimed to have been in bed asleep. There were a staggering 14 people giving evidence against Evelyn, but not a single person willing to support her in court. While they waited for the judge's decision, Evelyn spent weeks in prison, abandoned by her family and only visited once by her father. Evelyn was found guilty of conspiring to murder her husband and sentenced to life in prison. She was granted 10 minutes to speak in private with Evelyn before she was taken away. Evelyn continued to deny everything. Margaret gave her a folder with photos and pictures that Jessica and Joshua had drawn for her. And then she left. Apart from the following letter, Margaret and her family have never had any contact with Evelyn again. Dear Evelyn, you were convicted in court for the murder of your husband Stephen, with the help of your boyfriend Arnold Adore. Nothing you say will convince me that you're innocent. I am leaving you and the Philippines now. Justice has been done, and you will spend the next 40 years in prison. You will be an old woman with a wasted life. You had everything. Stephen called you his princess, and I loved you very much. You are an evil woman with no thought for the lives you have ruined. I hope the sacrifice of your family was worth the short time for your love with Adore. You took my son, and now I have yours, and your daughter, who someday will come and ask, "Why, Mummy? Why were you so bad and leave us and kill our daddy?" I will enjoy your children, and we shall have some happy times and not think of you. I will never forgive you or see you ever again. You were no longer a daughter of mine. Margaret.